Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining our Avalanche Rescue Journal Club session. This is the Virginia Tech Wilderness Medicine Fellowship Journal Club Series, January 2024. We have two articles tonight, one of which is a WMS guidelines and then a case report article. We also have a guest speaker joining us who's going to start us off tonight. Michael Buchanan, when you are ready, take it away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Buchanan. Just a little background. I am a flight paramedic with Intermountain Life Flight based here in Salt Lake City. I'm also a ground paramedic here in a suburb of Salt Lake. So I'm able to kind of do both here. I am a member of the Wilderness Medical Society. I recently, last year, got my FOM, which was pretty fun. I'm also the founder of a nonprofit called Mountain Medical Academy. We teach wilderness medicine. Hey, I just put my little one to my babysitter. That's awesome. So we teach a lot of avalanche first aid. We've been with our local access fund, climbers. We do a lot of like rock climbing first aid for the climbers, sort of big party and fundraiser they do. The great thing about the nonprofit is I'm able to really get the sage advice of a lot of good doctors. We have a pretty robust sort of a medical advisory board, which includes two of the authors of this guideline. One is Dr. Colin Grissom and one is Dr. Scott McIntosh. And then we have Dr. TJ Hartridge recently joined as well. So really we're able to have a lot of good information from them. So, and actually I was just looking at the WMS, this new update, and one of the co-authors is Dave Weber, who is also works for Intermountain Life Flight, but he's also kind of a really badass rescue sort of a climbing ranger in Denali and the Grand Tetons. So I think I first want to start sharing my screen here. And we're going to watch a quick video produced by the Utah Avalanche Center. I thought it's a few years old now. Oh, let's see. Where did you guys go? Oh, there we are. But it's still, I think, pretty instructive here. Let's see if we can't find it. Share. All right. Can you all hear that? Cannot hear. I was hoping you could. Hold on, stand by.
Oh, well, it happens.
Anybody have any tips on getting a shared screen video to work with audio? I've definitely had trouble with it myself.
I've always struggled with it.
Dang it. I know. I thought it would be super easy. Let's see if I can't select a microphone. Let's try this. Can you guys hear that? All right. Well, I would then just encourage you all to see this video. Can you guys see this at least? Yeah, I would encourage you all to go to just find this video. It's 4 minutes. It's called To Hell in a Heartbeat. It was produced by the Avalanche Center, and it's a pretty darn good look at kind of how everything goes down here. Sort of an actual rescue that was a success. All right, so let's see. Can you all see now the PowerPoint, or are you still on my desktop? Okay.
PowerPoint
awesome.
looks good.
Awesome.
You can see it looks great.
All right. So I developed this with the help of a couple doctors. Again, Dr. Grissom, Dr. McIntosh. Basically, after the avalanche, backcountry first aid for avalanche victims. And then we have a lot of input from the Avalanche Center and then Know Before You Go. So quick outline: causes of death for avalanche victims, prevention strategy, avalanche victim assessments, documentation, and conclusions. A lot of this, by the way, is really, all this information is either from the guidelines or from papers that are cited within the guidelines. So here in Utah, the major cause of death in avalanches is asphyxiation, and that's worldwide, but it accounts for 72% of all avalanche victims, followed by trauma, and then asphyxiation and trauma. So kind of a combination of both. So the chance of survival if you're buried, a partial burial means that your sort of chest and neck and head are above the snow. You have a 95% chance of surviving if you're partially buried. If you're critically buried, meaning your head and chest is below the snow, you will have kind of a 50-50 chance of survival. Burial time is really crucial to the survival rate. And this is sort of a famous graph that gets pushed around a lot, but it basically, on the y-axis, it says probability of survival. X-axis is duration of burial in minutes. So as you can see, and this kind of just compares a Canadian sample versus a Swiss sample, but the overall message is the same, that you have an 80% chance of survival if you're buried less than 10 minutes, a 40% chance of survival buried between 10 and 40 minutes, and a 10% chance of survival buried after 40 minutes. And then an 8% chance kind of after that. And I talk about the Canadian sample just because that's more in line of what we have here in the Western US. I think in the Eastern US, you guys might have something a little different as well. As I said, burial time is critical to survival. Basically, we kind of say that if you're buried 0 to 20 minutes, you're going to die by asphyxiation and or trauma. And if you're buried by longer than 60 minutes, you're going to die by hypothermia. So asphyxiation, 75% of the victims will die. Avalanche victims die by asphyxiation. And that is the insufficient oxygen supply to the body arising from rebreathing expired air, worsened by ice mass formation, or the physical blockage of the airway. In an avalanche, there are 3 ways to asphyxiate. O2 deprivation. So that means that the avalanche victim will rebreathe expired air, which decreases the oxygen supply and increases the CO2 in the air pocket and snow around the face. It's all about the fact that the porosity in an avalanche is very poor. So the porosity surrounding the victim of the air is very poor to the air out in the outside environment. So there's not a lot of exchange between the outside environment and the environment that the avalanche victim is in. So, you know, we breathe in 21% oxygen, we breathe out 16% oxygen, but then the environment becomes sort of hypercapnic. I think it probably says here 0.4% CO2 and then to 5% CO2, and it just gets worse and worse as we kind of breathe in and out. The larger the air pocket, you'll have an increased chance of survival. And it's the most common cause of asphyxiation. Blockage of the upper airway usually occurs during an avalanche. Basically, and there's a picture of the upper airway. Your upper airway, your nares, your mouth, your throat will just get clogged with snow and ice and debris, and then it'll physically block any sort of airway. And ice mass formation occurs because as we breathe in, as we all know, when we breathe in, the air we breathe in gets humidified. So when we breathe out, the air we breathe out is enriched in water vapor. And then that'll condense in front of you and actually form a physical barrier over time to airflow. But as the most common is oxygen deprivation. Trauma accounts for roughly 25% of avalanche victims. Avalanche victims die of trauma mainly from hitting trees, also boulders, maybe their own equipment like snowmobiles, flying off of cliffs. But I think the main culprit is trees. There's a paper that was written that compares avalanche trauma deaths in Europe where there's no trees versus the US where there are a lot of trees. And the European sort of casualties didn't see a lot of traumas. They saw a lot of, say, internal decapitations from being trundled around an actual avalanche. But because there's no trees, they didn't really have anything to hit. So the vast majority in that paper of trauma or people died by asphyxiation, not by traumas. Severe trauma causes death in buried and unburied victims, and really is a factor in survivability of the first 20 minutes. The trauma stuff it's hard because it's usually multi-system traumas, meaning traumas to the head, the neck, the torso, and even the sort of the legs. We all know that there's a lot of space for internal bleeding to occur. So it's pretty rare for these multi-trauma victims of avalanches to survive. But trauma will hasten asphyxiation, right? TBIs or chest trauma, pneumothoraxes, things like that will hasten asphyxiation. Hypothermia accounts for less than 1% of all victims of avalanches. In fact, there's been no recorded death by hypothermia in the state of Utah. And it's just a time thing. In an avalanche, death will most likely occur by trauma or asphyxiation long before hypothermia can cause death. So hypothermia is a huge concern after a rescue. It can exacerbate asphyxiation or trauma. We all remember the trauma triad of death. And it can complicate survival from massive bleeding. So it really is a huge concern for after a rescue. There was a really famous, I shouldn't say famous, but there was a famous in Utah. There was an avalanche that occurred a few years back where it was two parties. It was in Mill Creek. 4 people died, and one person was really responsible for kind of unburying everybody. And one of the survivors of the avalanche actually got hypothermic because he pulled this guy out and he was looking for everyone else. But he didn't pull him out all the way. He was still kind of stuck. He just made sure he was still breathing, but he didn't give him any sort of jacket or anything. And the guy actually ended up getting mild or moderate hypothermia. Burial depth is a factor in survival. Excuse me. Few victims worldwide were found buried below 8 feet. Deep burials require longer shovel times, which increases burial time, which decreases survivability. And just intrinsically, like heuristically, when we train for like a companion rescue, we don't really expect our beacons to say something like 4 or 5 meters, right? We always train it to go below 1 meter. So it's also maybe a heuristic thing. Burial time is the most important factor for survivability in an avalanche. So we're going to talk about a little bit about prevention strategies. Hoping for the best, preparing for the worst is sort of, I think, the mantra here. So always bring good rescue equipment, avalanche transceivers, fresh batteries, a shovel, a probe, right? This shouldn't be any news to anybody. But the Avalanche Center here in Utah did state that I think they estimate 40-50% of the people still go into the avalanche terrain without this equipment, which is really the thing that's going to save your life. I will say ice climbers, mountaineers are notorious for not having this equipment. And there are recorded deaths in accidents of North American climbing where in Colorado, for instance, people will be climbing near Telluride and an avalanche will come and bury the person ice climbing, and then they never find them, or it takes hours or even days to find the victim. It actually happens in Canada as well. So ice climbers are pretty notorious, and mountaineers are pretty notorious for not carrying this equipment. And of course, the knowledge of how to use them. Helmets are a good idea. It'll help prevent certain types of injuries. A ski helmet is preferable to a climbing helmet, and a climbing helmet's better than nothing at all. Like the Skimo guys, they wear climbing helmets because they're lightweight. They don't weigh anything. But a ski helmet is designed for sort of the impacts for skiing. really none of the helmets are designed for the impacts that you might have in an avalanche, because they can go up to 60 miles an hour. But it's better to wear it than not. Again, climbing helmets were designed for impacts generated, not were not designed for the impacts generated for skiing accidents. Most of them are designed to generate from rockfall from above. There are dual certified helmets. Gravel, I think, makes one. Maybe Petzl does now, but a lot of people don't wear helmets. So avalanche airbags are awesome. That's kind of the wave of the future. It can help prevent avalanche deaths by preventing burial. It kind of brings the person up and out of the snow. It creates an airspace around the head. So a lot of them, specifically the ones by Black Diamond or Arc'teryx, they'll actually suck the air out of the airbag if after a certain set amount of time, creating a larger airspace around the head. Anecdotally, I don't think that any sort of papers have been published about this, but they will prevent head trauma. And I should say that Dr. Grissom and Dr. McIntosh, they have a paper that kind of went in and studied the effectiveness of the old snorkels, the Avalung that was made by Black Diamond. Basically, it was a snorkel you put in the mouth. You breathed in fresh air from your chest and expired air behind your back. And then they did another study with the new Avalanche airbags that compared the results between basically the Avalung and these airbags for people that are buried. And the test results showed that the people that were buried after with a sort of airspace created by these Avalanche airbags, they showed no decrease in SpO2, no hypercapnia, and nothing like that. So these, as far as the test results, work pretty well. However, there are problems. Obviously, there's a study on avalanche airbags, and one of the main culprits is people fail to use the equipment correctly. So like the CO2 canisters aren't properly inserted, for instance. The batteries weren't charged, they weren't packed right. The person that got put in an avalanche wasn't able to pull the ripcord, things like that. First aid kit, just a quick thing. I carry SAM splints, hemostatic gauze, Israeli battle dressings. I always carry a survival kit, a bivy sack, high calorie foods for hypothermia prevention. I always carry a headlamp, easy fire tinder, 2 forms of fire starter, a lighter, and waterproof matches. One thing that, if you didn't know this, helicopters, if you have a helicopter agency that is certified to use night vision goggles are blind to LEDs. They can't see LEDs, which most headlamps are made of, but you can see like cell phones from miles away. You can see a cell phone in the dark in the middle of a dark wooded area from a helicopter with night vision goggles, super far away. And then same with fires. So if you are benighted after an avalanche, having a fire going or having your cell phone on, especially if you start to hear the helicopter, is a pretty good way to start to try to get them to know where you are. Communication, I like to think about it from the 30,000 foot view down to the close view. So I'm a big fan of walkie-talkies just within a group. Having good group communication removes that or helps remove one heuristic for avalanche deaths. Cell phones, obviously, we all carry cell phones, so you might as well just keep carrying your cell phone. Although there is some evidence that cell phones do interfere with some the avalanche transceivers. I carry an emergency locator beacon, these Garmin's, like this is the InReach Mini. It's like $300 and $100, $120 a year for the service. I carry a signal mirror in the day. I can signal a helicopter. Do not carry a laser to signal a helicopter. That's against FAA regulations. Whistle to signal rescuers. And then a small power bank to sort of power my cell phone. I also like those Mylar blankets that are orange because those are easy to see. Trip prep. This is another thing that people get in trouble for. Check the forecast, check the weather for the day and the night, and prepare for the worst weather that you might expect for the intended ski area, zone, peak, aspect, slope. I'm old school. I carry a topo map with compass because I expect everything to fail. And then tell someone where you're going. And if you change plans, tell somebody that the plans are going to change, and say when you're going to get back. And then just mental preparation. I'm trained as a paramedic. I used to be a climbing guide, and I always sort of think about what's the worst thing that can absolutely happen, and am I prepared to deal with that with what I have on me? And if I'm not, is it a risk that I'm willing to take? What's the risk? And so a lot of times I like to do little thought experiments about, like, where I'm going to go, what's going to happen if there's a really like super close backcountry ski here at Salt Lake. It's called Short Swing. It's one of the quickest, easiest backcountry skis you can get to. Routes. It's a quick hike up. It's a quick ski down. But I had a friend, he broke his arm. It's like tight trees through some aspens and some places. He broke his arm, and what should have been a 10-minute ski out took 4 or 5 hours. So, just things to think about. So the victim assessment, the wilderness these WMS guidelines, they show all sorts of algorithms, and they're great. I think they're awesome, but they're also kind of confusing. So I kind of broke them down into maybe a little easier to understand with the help of Dr. Hartridge. So the first response strategies, it really is up to you and your group to survive an avalanche. If as we learned, a 20-minute, you have at max 20 minutes to survive an avalanche. And it can, if you don't know this, and I don't know what it's like in Virginia or back east, I know what it's like out here in the West, but it can take hours for help to arrive. And the Wasatch is super close. Like, we have ski resorts, we have helicopters up the wazoo, right? Like, Life Flight has helicopters all up and down the Wasatch. AirMed has helicopters. There's private companies that will, the private heli ski companies, they have helicopters. There's ski patrollers that work with the helicopter agencies, that work with search and rescue. And it can take hours to get all those resources to bear on an accident site. So, and unfortunately by then, you're saving people that haven't been in the avalanche, or worse, you're looking for a body. So it really is up to you. Big thing for scene safety. It's a paramedic. I'm really big into scene safety. The triangle, right, is your response. Like, the top of the triangle, you are the most important person in any scene of an avalanche, followed by the fellow rescuer, followed by the victim. There's actually a base after that. It's everybody else. So you are responsible for your own safety. And the safety of yourself is the most important thing. If you get hurt, you multiply the emergency scene, because instead of having one person hurt, now you have 2 people hurt. And then same with your fellow rescuer. I always check and mitigate all hazards. I kind of take a beat, step back, and I think about things. So things to think about scene safety wise in an avalanche: additional avalanches, dangerous weather. Are you exhausted? Are you becoming potentially hypothermic? Are you getting frostbite? The most important thing is that you as a rescuer should not become another victim. There's lots of stories about rescuers becoming victims. I think one of the most famous ones, maybe out in your neck of the woods, is the Mount Washington disaster, where Hugh Herr, a famous climber way back in the day, got benighted in Mount Washington. He lost his legs, and then a rescuer from the search and rescue group got killed in an avalanche. So here's a simplified, as I said, the WMS. If you want to look at through some of these different algorithms, there's a lot of good ones. The Avalife is a great one. The ICAR one is really good, from Manuel Genswein. And then the the Expiatorial Life Support Project, the Avalanche Rescue, they're all really good. However, a lot of them are made for a model for Europe that we don't have here in the US, unfortunately. A lot of it is being able to get to ALS super quick and having cardiac ECMO available. We really struggle with that here in the US. Just the models are a lot different. So I, with the help of one of the doctors, came up with something super simple. Signs of life, yes or no. If there are signs of life, support breathing, assess for injuries, prevent hypothermia, call for help. If there aren't any signs of life, open the airway. Is there spontaneous breathing? Yes, there's spontaneous breathing. You just support breathing, assess injuries, prevent hypothermia, call for help. If there isn't spontaneous breathing, give 5 rescue breaths. If there's a return to spontaneous breathing, you go back to that. And if not, you start CPR. For greater than 60 minutes, it's something similar. If there are signs of life, you support breathing, but you want to slow down and be gentle, because really here, you're starting to get into hypothermic victims, and you sort of want to start to look at the guidelines for hypothermia, especially if they have major hypothermia, if they are have altered mental status, low heart rate, things like that. You want to start to prevent rescue collapse. The heart could be really in a dangerous place. So insulate, rewarm, call for help. If there are no signs of life, if there's a patent airway, you're going to start CPR, and you can do intermittent CPR, meaning 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, and then call for help. If there's no patent airway, then the Avalanche victim probably died of trauma or of asphyxiation. Here's another Avalanche victim algorithm. This was created by 2 of the authors of this paper for Backcountry Zero, Dr. Wheeler and Dr. McIntosh. This breaks it down into, again, less than 60 and greater than 60 minutes. And then on the columns, signs of life or no signs of life. And it's very similar to the simplified one that we used. So we all know signs of life, right? Airway, is anything obstructing the airway? Breathing, is the victim breathing? Circulation, does the victim have a pulse? Is the victim bleeding uncontrollably? Disability, head, neck, or spinal injury, and exposure, is the victim hypothermic? When you first get to an avalanche victim, your main priority is to uncover the head. Find the head and get to the head and uncover it. Uncover that airway, because that could be, that's the most important thing. You want to make sure that they're breathing. And if they're not breathing, even at this moment right here, say in this picture, you could easily start rescue breaths on this guy if he's unresponsive. Now, you don't know if this guy has major trauma or not, but he has no major facial trauma. So it could be something as easy, as opening up that airway and starting some rescue breaths. If there's anything blocking the airway, sometimes it's a good idea to sort of try to do, we don't really teach in CPR anymore the blind finger sweep, but it might be a good idea for these people. Clear that airway. Breathing, look for signs of life. Can you see breaths? Listen for signs of breathing. Feel for signs of breathing, chest rise and fall. Circulation pulse, check for the carotid pulse. And recommend to check for 60 seconds, which is a little bit longer than what we normally would expect. But if you have somebody that's severely bradycardic, you might only feel a pulse, a couple times a minute, so and they might have a really faint pulse as well. So make sure you do a good long check. Major bleeding, we all know what major bleeding looks like. There's not a lot of major external bleeding in avalanche victims. A lot of the bleeding is internal. Or if you read some of the ME reports of avalanche victims, it's the trauma is not sustainable for life. You're talking about major head trauma with brain showing, and major chest trauma, major obvious chest trauma. There are stories of people getting limbs ripped off, and it's the trauma. People don't survive traumas in avalanches. It's pretty rare. Disability, Avalanche poses severe MOI to cervical spine. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, the trauma that can occur to victims of avalanches where there's no trees are internal decapitations in one study in Europe. Attempt to protect the cervical spine as much as possible. Victims shouldn't try to move their head or neck. Handle the victim gently, and tell the victim to keep the head aligned with the body. And in my experience, people with neck injuries, unless they're severely altered for whatever reason, tend to do this anyway. And you can actually refer to the WMS's practice guidelines for head and spinal cord injuries. Super important to keep the victim warm. So here's a simulation here where they have an avalanche victim, and they pulled him out, and they're putting sort of warm blankets, his warm jacket on there. Treat every victim as if they have hypothermia. Reduce the heat loss as much as possible. Protect from wind. Warm the torso. Provide high calorie food and drink if they're conscious and able to take it. Because calories is to warmth as wood is to fire. And they went through, most likely an avalanche victim has a huge adrenaline dump, and they will have a high caloric need. Again, only if conscious and alert. So here's the sticky stuff, is the no signs of life. Airway, the airway is blocked. Breathing, the victim's not breathing. Circulation, the victim has no pulse. Clear the airway and give 5 rescue breaths and start CPR. Clear the airway, give 5 rescue breaths. Jaw thrust is preferable, but head tilt, chin lift will work as well. We all know how to give rescue breaths. I teach a lot of CPR, and this is probably the only time this in a drowning. If you think about an avalanche victim is basically a drowning victim, right? And so because their heart stops, not because of a cardiac issue that they've developed over years of really bad lifestyle choices, it's a respiratory arrest problem. And so rescue breaths can be really effective for avalanche victims. And so in my estimation, because I mainly go with people I know, I would probably do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on people that I know, more so in an avalanche. I would never even think about doing that. And we've all seen, a cardiac arrest and all the stuff that can happen with that. But I would do this for my family and friends for sure. So this is probably the only time that you should probably do this. That obviously this isn't taught really much anymore. CPR, we all know what CPR is like, so I'm not really gonna belabor it too much. But here's all the new, all the current recommendations from AHA. So terminating resuscitation efforts. If CPR has been going on for 30 minutes, you're probably not going to get the person back. If you're alone, if it's maybe just a few of you in the backcountry, there's no help coming, or help is coming, but they're not there, and you've been doing CPR for 30 minutes, it's probably nothing's going to bring this person back. If the scene becomes no longer safe, or you physically can't perform CPR, 30 minutes of CPR alone is physically exhausting, or advanced medical professionals take over. Now, there is some thoughts on prolonging CPR until rescue arrives. That's if the victim was buried longer than 60 minutes and the victim had a clear airway when rescued. The thought being that the victim died not from asphyxiation, not from trauma, unless they have obvious trauma, but they died from hypothermia. And hypothermic victims can come back. You can get these people back more so than an asphyxiated victim. Again, greater than 60 minutes with signs of life, airways not blocked, they're breathing. We're going to check breathing for 60 seconds. We're going to check pulse for 60 seconds. If there are signs of life after prolonged burial, the victim may be suffering from severe hypothermia. We're going to slow down, handle them gently, keep the victim laying down, avoid moving the victim as much as possible, right? We don't want to, it's pretty easy for somebody in severe hypothermia just to be moved around a lot, to go into a heart rhythm, let's say like VFib. VFib is probably the most common one, VTAC. I've seen it not in a sort of a wilderness setting, but a few years ago, I saw a homeless person that had severe hypothermia, and we got to him. We put the patches on, and he would go from a sinus Brady to this VFib, and you'd shock him, and he'd come back, and it was pretty intense. And you would see their heart every kind of jolt of the ambulance. You would see the rhythm, their heart rhythm would change, not because of sort of the patches or the leads moving, but because the heart was getting irritated. You're going to insulate the victim. You're going to monitor the pulse and breathing constantly. And you may have to perform CPR if the victim becomes pulseless. Again, greater than 60 minutes and no signs of life. If there's a clear airway, CPR should be performed. If there's a blocked airway, no pulse, not breathing, really CPR shouldn't be performed because they probably died long before you got to them. Check for pulse and breathing for 60 seconds. Start CPR, assess the airway. If the airway is blocked, yeah, this is basically what I already said. I apologize. So withholding resuscitation efforts, obvious death due to traumatic injury, brain matter, lots of blood, obvious head or neck injury, burial time greater than 60 minutes with a blocked airway and cold body temperature. Do not perform CPR. As I believe said numerous times, victim most likely succumbed from asphyxiation. Stiff chest due to hypothermia, and you cannot physically perform CPR due to the frozen torso. Usually these people are buried longer than 60 minutes. It's nice to have clear documentation if you can. So have your time of avalanche, how long they're buried, condition of the airway, was CPR performed and how long, any trauma, and what treatments that you performed. So in conclusion, burial time is the most important factor in avalanche survival. Trauma can cause death instantly or slowly. Asphyxia can occur within 20 minutes, and hypothermia becomes a concern after 60 minutes. Asphyxia is the #1 cause of death, followed by trauma, then hypothermia. And your partners can affect the outcome greater than anybody else. You should not wait for a rescue. Prevention is the best way to avoid death by avalanche. Stay out of avalanche terrain as much as possible. Wear a helmet. Consider an avalanche airbag. It should be noted that the vast majority of people that die in avalanches die in it's in considerable avalanche hazard. So not the extreme and not the two extreme ends of the scale, but the middle of the scale. People think, well, it's considerable, but it's not extreme. That's a heuristic thing. A couple people that helped me out with this: Dr. Colin Grissom, Dr. Scott McIntosh, Dr. Wheeler, Dr. Lane, a couple other people, Dr. Smith, who's out of Jackson, Dr. Hartridge as well, and then Utah Avalanche Center and Backcountry Zero. Yeah. Does anybody have any? I also say a lot of the new protocols, they kind of go into a lot of hypothermia, which is awesome. I would encourage everybody to go go online and check out the HOPE score. It's the hypothermic score that you can kind of put in some different variables, and you could see the chance of survival from hypothermia. It's pretty interesting. Oh, I see there's a bunch of chats. I apologize. So does anyone have any questions?
I just had one question. Going back to the study that you said was done in Europe, where there aren't as many trees. compared to the US where there are more trees. Were the mortality rates about the same for those avalanches, or was there a difference?
As far as like the sheer number or the percentages versus trauma and asphyxia and things like that?
I was just curious on numbers. I was curious as to whether the tree trauma in the US was just preceding the other trauma that people would have died from in Europe. If that actually made a difference, if the trees actually had anything to do with mortality, or if that was just
so I think it might be instructive to think about maybe the percentage of deaths. So here in the US and Canada, most places in the world, it's pretty average. 75% die from asphyxia, 25 from trauma, and less than 1% hypothermia. In that study, it was less than 1% died from trauma, and it was something like 95% died from asphyxia. So the vast majority died from asphyxia. So that's kind of why they postulate that a lot of people are getting hit by trees, and a lot of the work done here in the Utah, Colorado, and Canada sort of bears that out as well. Trees are gnarly. They can cause, and if you didn't know, an avalanche can really it can get speed 60 miles an hour very quickly, and so there's no outrunning an avalanche. The best thing to do is try to, if you can, side hill it, and if you're in an avalanche, there's a lot of maybe techniques to try to figure out things like that, to try to maybe protect yourself. One thing is to keep put your hands over your mouth to kind of create an air pocket, but also trying to keep stuff out of your mouth. When you see the avalanche start to settle, you could try to put your arm in the crook, like you're doing like the vampire cough, which we were all doing back in COVID, but then try to like stick your extremities out to try to, maybe your hand can pop up above the snow. People have been found quicker than say their beacon can find somebody, just by, hey, there's a glove there, or there's a boot over there, there's a foot in that boot, or there's a hand in that glove. So that can be really helpful.
I have one question. So I'll be presenting the case report later today, and we'll get into that. But I was wondering if you're familiar with any protocols that are like already established for people who are severely dehydrated following an avalanche, and who might also be hypothermic. Is there any way, or are there any protocols that tell you how much fluids you should be giving them? Like, should we be following that 4-2-1 rule, maybe give an initial bolus, or is there some other, I guess, protocol out there?
That's a really good question, and I do not know the answer to that. I know if it were me, and we were to look at some victims of avalanches, just empirically thinking about it, I might check a blood pressure and base my fluids off of that, like if it's a low systolic, or something that I'm uncomfortable with. But I would also make sure that the fluids, if I was to do an IV, kind of keep them warm. Warm fluids is better than not, because you don't want to get them hypothermic. But I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. If anybody else does that, I'd love it.
It's a good question. I was just curious.
That is a good question. Yeah, I never thought of that.
Where is avalanche relative to the other causes of winter mountain deaths?
That's a pretty good question, and I honestly don't know the answer to that. I know, in the US, for instance, roughly 100 people die every year by an avalanche, plus or minus, right? In the US, people, and who knows how many people that get into an avalanche. The problem is, a lot of people that might get into an avalanche, if they're partially buried, they may never report that, because they just got partially buried. They dig themselves out and they're like, oh, that was a thing. Oh man, that was crazy. But I do know in other parts of the world, let's talk about, say, the Himalaya. People that are in Himalayan style or sized avalanches, they most definitely do not survive. Those are huge avalanches that bury people really deep. And as I said, a lot of mountaineers don't carry the avalanche equipment to begin with. But you know, I had a friend die 5 or 6 years ago by an avalanche in the Himalaya, and he just got ripped off of a 5,000 foot face, and like, there was no surviving that. So, but here in the U.S., it's approximately 100 people. How that differs from other snow sport injuries, uh, I think, you know, I'd have to really look at the data from Utah. I recently, a couple of years ago, I saw a presentation on snow sport injuries in Utah, and they did provide a statistic, but I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. But I do know like falls and hitting trees are the big ones.
Mhm. Thank you.
How's this year looking for Avalanche compared to last year? I think last year was pretty rough.
So last year here in Utah, we had an epic snow year. It was like a 100-year snow cycle. We had more snow last year than I think that anybody had, and a lot of the canyons were closed. What's this year? I mean, who's to say, right? I don't I I can't recall. Nobody's died in Utah yet, but we haven't had the snow year. It's still kind of early. Our snowpack isn't all that great, and that's what they predicted. It's kind of a nice. It was like 40 degrees out this morning in front of my house. Like all the snow was melted. So, but who's to say? Because a lot of times, like a couple of years ago with the avalanche that I alluded to, there were here in Utah 4 people that died a week before. 2 people died, and then a bunch of people died in Colorado along that same snow cycle. So it just takes sometimes one snow cycle for something to happen. And in fact, that year that 4 people, or 4 or 6 people died in a couple week period in Utah, then there was the first black rose. Like if you know avalanches, they have like a rose, and the rose represents cardinal points, north, south, east, and west, and then elevation. And a black rose means it's extreme avalanche hazard, all aspects, all elevations. And it was that year was the first time it had that, and then it had it again. And people tend to not go out when it's like that, luckily. Heuristically, if you're really interested, there's a lot of really good papers on heuristics and why people find themselves in avalanches, and that's actually just as interesting as anything else. Any other questions?
That's what I was trying to ask. I was muted. That looked like Dora just posted one.
All right. If you have a person with spinal injury and have to wait for a rescue for a longer period of time, would you risk moving him or her to insulate them from the snow, or would hypothermia be a lesser problem? So snow, what's interesting, Dr. Grissom wrote a paper years ago about the how well snow insulates, basically. And snow, as we kind of can think empirically, insulates really well, right? That's why you dig a snow cave, right? And mountaineers do this all the time. They'll dig a snow cave because it's warm. The problem is it's not the snow necessarily, but it's the outside air temperature that might be a huge problem. So, if you're trained and you're worried about a spinal cord injury, you could always if you have enough people, you could always insulate their anything that's in contact with the snow by doing a log roll if you have enough people and you're trained. But in that situation, I would do the best you can. Start a fire. There's if you're in a survival situation, right, there's no reason that you shouldn't start a fire. That's one of the big things that Utah Avalanche Center, they really harp on is be ready to start fire, because you might be out all night. And fire, it has a warm, not only does it have a warming property, right, but it has a psychological property. Like, oh, there's a fire, things aren't going to be that bad, life is good. And there's probably not really going to have to worry about starting a forest fire, right? So in the middle of winter. but I would always worry about hypothermia. That's one of the things that I worry about the most in trauma. And I'm when I do ground medic stuff, I'm sort of the hypothermia Nazi when it comes to trauma. I'm getting people warm blankets. We have warmers for our IVs. We warm up the back of the ambulance or the back of the helicopter super hot. I think that you should be really proactive at preventing hypothermia in any situation. I hope that answers your question.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. That was very thorough and very detailed and engaging because we talked about this shortly today. We had a fellowship event at a ski resort, which in West Virginia, and we touched on avalanche rescue, but I was looking forward to this because it really expanded on it. So thank you.
Yeah. And I'm hopefully if you guys are around this summer, the WMS conference is happening here in Snowbird or up here in Salt Lake. So I'll be around. I'm talking with some of the committee members about trying to help teach, specifically Dr. Beasy, trying to help teach for that event. And I'm probably maybe put something on in the 4,000 or 14,000 or whatever, one of those little
Yeah. 14 yeah.
So hopefully if you guys see me, come up and chat with me. I really dig on this avalanche stuff. It's awesome.
Well,
Boy, Michael, thank you tons for your time so much. I had a quick question to toss out there if you have a moment.
Yeah.
I was curious kind of with the avalanche airbags, kind of what you've seen. Do you see like any, his first question is like, how often are you seeing them? Just kind of, from your experience. And then do you see any like compensatory risk taking that people like feel they're superhuman because they have this avalanche airbag?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that last question is a question that's as old as time, right? So if it's not the avalanche airbag, I remember when I first started to backcountry ski 20 years ago, I worked at REI as a sort of a stock clerk, and we would always talk about do avalanche beacons cause people to take bigger risks, right? And so that's a pretty old question. And I would say the risk you take is sort of how comfortable you are, or a how comfortable you are, or B how maybe ignorant, that might be a strong word, but how ignorant you are to the danger you're putting yourself in. There's a really good book called The Limits of Safety Gonzalez's Deep Survival. If you guys want to read a really good book, I can't remember the first name of the author, but the last name is Gonzalez, and it's called Deep Survival. And he talks about how people will get into situations and they will sort of like, let's say you're a snowmobile or backcountry skier, you get partially buried. You're like, oh man, that was crazy. And then they think, well, I survived that time and I was considerable avalanche danger, so I don't really have to worry about this problem anymore. But really, they were lucky that they survived. And so that's sort of a heuristic thing. As far as people that have avalanche airbags, there is a steep barrier to entry. I think they're expensive. They're about $800, $1,000, right?
Wow.
The Black Diamond ones are $1,000. The Arc'teryx ones, you have to, unless they've changed it since I looked last, you had to buy everything separately, which was kind of annoying, and it ended up being like $1,500. Those two are the ones that I would probably want because they have they're battery powered. They use a fan. There's no CO2 cartridges. And the other problem is they're quite heavy. So, they've gotten lighter as they've sort of progressed, but they're still heavier than a normal pack. And so those two things alone cause people not to have them. So for example, I bought my first one this year, but my wife has been wearing one for like 5 or 6 years because her risk for this stuff is she's a little less risk averse than me. That's a heuristic thing too, because men tend to be more risk takers than women. But but I would say they're not nearly as adopted as they should be. And they do, but there is a lot of evidence that they do save lives. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and if you have the money, I would say buy one. As I said, they're expensive. Backcountry skiing's expensive, so snowmobiling is even more expensive. So what's another? I mean, you spend $2 or $3 grand on a backcountry setup anyway. Maybe instead of buying the next pair of skis that you don't really need anyway, buy an Avalanche airbag.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And to kind of keep us moving, I just looked at the clock and saw it's been an hour.
Oh, so I apologize.
No. That is fantastic. Everybody's been very engaged, so great talk. To kind of follow up on that, and somewhat cover similar topics, but Sarah, can you go us through the WMS guidelines?
Yes, and I set mine up so I could do it more or less thorough. So I am, oh, wait. So are you looking at slides or the whole thing? You're looking at the whole thing. Sorry, guys. How do I just do it? Normally it does a, there we go, portion screen. All right, so I will run through the Wilderness Medical Society 2024 updated avalanche guidelines, and I'm happy to share these slides with whoever wants them later. I did a deeper review, but then I also starred the take-home messages with these fireworks. So we're gonna do the fireworks version of this talk. So whenever this is somewhere on the slide, it's and I put it in the chat, but I bought a former boyfriend one of these. I went out on a limb and I had a pro deal at the time, and I bought him one too, and he dumped me 2 weeks before, but I gave it to him anyway because I was like, I'd never forgive myself if something happened. So take home messages on recommendations, avalanche avoidance guidelines. Their recommendations are that travelers should obtain avalanche education through courses, such as with Michael, books and videos. Number 2 is use avalanche advisories and decision aids for trip planning and avalanche terrain, and that was grade 1C. And exercise conservative judgment and risk mitigation strategies, which is ungraded expert consensus. I will say a few of my friends who've died in avalanches probably shouldn't have been out there, but 3 of them, they did everything right. It was just really bad luck. Physical maneuvers, like Michael talked about, raising your arm up, the consensus on equipment considerations and recommendations. To avoid being caught in an avalanche, experienced backcountry users can use slope cutting and a belay. If caught in an avalanche, immediately attempt to escape the moving snow, or if engulfed, fight, swim in any way possible to avoid a complete burial. And if caught in an avalanche and unable to escape the moving snow, a victim should jettison their skis and their snowboards because they, in theory, bring you lower. Using a backpack can help mitigate spinal and cervical trauma, and that was expert consensus. They did weigh in on the avalanche airbags as far as preventing burial. They say they may or may not provide head and neck protection from trauma, but that that travelers entering avalanche terrain should consider using these airbags and practicing with it, which is tough because if you practice with it, you have to get it repacked, or be an expert at repacking it yourself. And so the other recommendation for trauma prevention, they recommend helmets anytime you're traveling in an avalanche terrain. And I don't know about you guys, but I wear a helmet every time I'm out on skis. To avoid asphyxia, They recommended physical maneuvers. If buried and if caught in an avalanche, they should protect their airway and create an air pocket, like Michael said. Reach across the face with an arm to buy themselves more space, placing the crook of the elbow over the mouth. And then that was a review of artificial air pocket devices. Regarding those, the recommendations were that someone in an avalanche terrain could consider using an artificial air pocket device if they had it, and that could buy them some time until they're recovered also. And this avalanche rescue can involve self-rescue or your group rescue. If you're waiting for search and rescue, it takes a long time for these teams to mobilize. So regarding avalanche rescue sequence recommendations, there was a whole outline: establish leadership, survey the scene for safety. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've been on a rescue where we were not allowed to go in by our boss because of overhanging danger to us. And it was in the same place that I think 24 people had been taken out in 80 years ago, trying to hike up to save some people that were caught in an avalanche. And so it was just a place where he just didn't let us go. Search the surface, do a transceiver search, pinpoint probe search, strategic shoveling, and then hopefully medical care and evacuation. And so that was the outline for the avalanche rescue sequence recommendations. Then regarding the transceiver search, they recommend that all travelers in avalanche terrain carry avalanche transceivers and know how to perform effective searches and practice these skills regularly. Play transceiver tag. Rescuers should keep transceivers a minimum of 20 centimeters from other electronics and metal objects, such as your cell phone. So maybe have your cell phone in one pocket and your transceiver 20 centimeters away. And they said a minimum of 50 centimeters away when you're in search mode. And that was grade 1B, so that was pretty high data. Regarding other location devices, they said electronic devices other than avalanche transceivers are not recommended for locating buried avalanche victims during small group rescue. And that would be like the companion rescue, telecommunications devices, or cell phones or satellite phones. Regarding pinpoint searches, all travelers in avalanche terrain should carry and know how to use a 3-meter collapsible probe. For the pinpoint search, this technique should include probing in a perpendicular fashion using a concentric circular pattern with probe holes spaced 25 centimeters apart. Regarding strategic shoveling, this one's pretty common sense. All shovelers in avalanche terrain should carry and know how to use the metal shovel designed for avalanche debris. Shoveling techniques should include using the shovel like a paddle to plow snow downhill. A conveyor belt should be used if there's multiple rescuers and if multiple rescuers are available. And again, I'm happy to share these slides with anybody. It's just a summary of everything in the article. Regarding dog rescue, they said no significant improvement in survival compared to organized probe line searches. I will say that bringing in the dog made it a lot easier to do and quicker to do a body recovery. So professional rescue recommendations: active scene management and techniques such as boundary control and scene marking employed. Organized rescue group members should be trained in ICS for practical application in avalanche rescue. For probe lines, the initial probe pass should be limited to a depth of about 1.5 meters, using 3 holes per step or slalom probing methods to cover a 50 by 50 centimeter grid. Professional rescue teams should have RECO search capabilities, and that was RECO is a detector that identifies reflector diodes that are embedded in people's clothing. That's something that's relatively new. If you're buying clothing, it might have a reflector diode in the clothing that would only start emitting when it was getting a signal. It's actually pretty cool. I think that's probably going to come the way of the Avalanche backpack. And I didn't price them out to see if they're more expensive. Rescue teams should consider using dogs trained in avalanche rescue to facilitate searching debris for buried people, despite the disadvantages described. But particularly if the victim's not wearing a transceiver and the initial sequence has failed. I really feel like the dogs found the people pretty quickly. So I would always be a fan of bringing in the dog. Professional rescue teams should consider using helicopter teams that are specifically trained in avalanche rescue if available. Rescuers should employ a risk assessment before helicopter use and follow strict safety guidelines. And that was this was their recommendations on helicopter rescue, dog rescue, using RECO and probing techniques summary. And this was, Michael did a phenomenal outline on resuscitation, and I actually really appreciated the simplified version. They also had a duration of burial if it's greater than 60 minutes. Are there signs of life? Yes. Minimally invasive rewarming, like, gentle with these hypothermic people, get them to the hospital. If the duration was less than 60 minutes, pull out ALS. So I thought, Michael, I really liked your, not simplification because it's the same information, but it just made more sense to my brain, and I appreciated that. Resuscitation of an uninjured, full burial. A completely buried patient, even if uninjured, should be transported to the nearest medical facility capable of evaluating and resuscitating. Resuscitation of a trauma victim. It should include trauma care. Suspected spine injuries should be managed according to the Nexus or Canadian C-spine rules. With regards to hypothermia, their recommendations were avalanche resuscitation should include treatment of hypothermia according to the WMS practice guidelines for out-of-hospital evacuation and treatment for accidental hypothermia, or the European Resuscitation Council guidelines, and that was expert consensus. And the big thing with them is just, you don't want to like overload them and get all that cold blood going back into their core to shock their heart. The initiating resuscitation, expert consensus. If vital signs are not detectable and there are no indications for withholding resuscitation, they should start CPR, ALS while further assessment is performed. If ROSC is not achieved after at least 30 minutes, resuscitation attempts may be stopped with certain exceptions. If the duration of burial is greater than 60 minutes, if the core temperature is less than 30, and the victim has had a patent airway on rescue, the arrest is, like Michael said, likely due to hypothermia, and you should continue CPR and transport the patient to the hospital, hopefully a hospital with ECLS capability. Defibrillating in hypothermic patients. If a defibrillator is available and a shockable rhythm is detected, defibrillation attempts according to standard local protocols. And so we should have these defibrillation recommendations in the WMS practice guidelines for snow burial accidents. And if VF persists after 1 to 3 defibrillations, provide or withhold further defibrillation attempts according to local protocols. If it's not successful, continue CPR beyond 30 minutes until the patient is rewarmed to a core temperature greater than 30 degrees. That was helpful for me. I always need numbers that I can anchor on. So, okay, rewarm the person until their core is greater than 30 degrees after about 3 defibrillation attempts, and continue CPR on these people. As far as ACLS goes, if the duration of burial is less than 60 minutes or their core temperature is greater than 30, just do standard resuscitation. If possible and available, including volume resuscitation and endotracheal intubation with normal capnic ventilation if indicated. And they said with regards to mechanical chest compressions, if available, mechanical chest compression should be used for difficult and long transports. So that's your Lucas device. With regards to delayed and intermittent resuscitation, if continuous CPR is not possible in a patient with a core temperature less than 28 degrees or with unknown core temperature but unequivocal hypothermic cardiac arrest, we can use intermittent CPR with 5 minutes of CPR alternating with less than 5 minute interruptions. If the core temperature is less than 20 degrees, the interruptions can be as long as 10 minutes. As far as withholding or terminating, if a completely buried victim is in cardiac arrest that has clearly been caused by trauma They say rescuers should withhold resuscitation. So that's like clear brain matter. You'll know. As far as duration, if an avalanche victim is found pulseless and apneic, regardless of cardiac rhythm and duration of burial is less than 60 minutes or core temp is greater than 30, rescuers can withhold or terminate resuscitation if ROSC does not occur after 30 minutes, or depending on local regulations or statutes. And if the victim is found pulseless and apneic with an obstructed airway and duration of burial is greater than 60 minutes or core temp is less than 30, rescuers should withhold or terminate a resuscitation. It's a hard thing to do though, isn't it? In an avalanche victim who has a serum potassium of greater than 8, rescuers can withhold resuscitation. I don't know how we're getting this serum potassium on the side of a mountain. Somebody has better equipment than me. If rescuers are at high risk from terrain or weather, further rescue attempts should be delayed until conditions improve or risks can be mitigated. And that's the whole thing, seeing safety for all of us. And as far as transfer to definitive care, a hypothermic avalanche victim with cardiac arrest or instability should be transferred as rapidly as possible to a facility with ECLS capabilities appropriate to manage the victim where they exist. And then this is like a little decision tree card. Time of burial, yes, no. I do like decision trees. And this is another resuscitation checklist. And like I said, I'm happy to share these slides with anybody. Checklist recommendations. And I love, if anyone hasn't read or listened to the checklist manifesto by Atul Gawande and hasn't yet appreciated the magnificence of using checklists, please read it. The recommendations here are that an avalanche resuscitation algorithm should be used whenever possible, and a checklist can be employed to improve adherence to the resuscitation algorithm. And I think we're getting close. We're almost there. Avoiding falling into, non-avalanche snow burial wrecks. Avoiding falling into tree wells. And I've had several friends, it's kind of comical once you survive, who've spent a night upside down in a tree well. It's weird enough when it happens to one person, but when it happens to two, it's a problem. Deep powder snow are the only known means of preventing non-avalanche snow burial. A victim of one of these snow burials should keep skis or snowboard attached to avoid sinking deeper and to provide visible clues to rescuers. And this may mean that you're upside down. Evidence is insufficient to recommend the use of transceivers, avalanche airbags, or other search tools in these non-avalanche snow burials. And then discussion of their safety guidelines, prevention, rescue, resuscitation. This is just a summary. And thank you so much. I love this journal club.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, for joining you. She's presented pretty frequently, been very dedicated to joining. So thank you again, Sarah.
You're welcome. I'll do it if no one else will.
Any questions on the guidelines? Again, they are pretty tightly tied in with Michael's presentation. So I think it's a double coverage of avalanche rescue right there.
Try not to overlap them too much. So I hope that was good for everyone, but we'll see. Yeah,
so next up we have Michael A. who's going to be presenting our journal article case report, and it ties in avalanche rescue and hypothermia. So it should be a good way to combine what we've just talked about. And take it away. You have share screen.
Yes, thank you. All right. Where do I? Okay, hello everyone. So I'm Michael Artov. I'm a fourth-year medical student at Tulane University in New Orleans. And today I'll be presenting surviving 20 hours of critical avalanche burial and a core temperature of 22.5 degrees C, which happened in the Austrian Alps. And this was the third longest known case of critical avalanche burial, which happened in 2000. So let us, I have no disclosures or any disclaimers or financial incentives. So the case was in January of 2000. And there were three friends who were out skiing in the western Austrian Alps on a warmer day. It was -10 degrees C, which is about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And at the top of the summit, the 24-year-old male snowboarder invited one of his friends to descend from the summit station of the skiing area into a deep powder snow-off piste. I don't know how many of y'all snowboard, but there have definitely been some times where I was looking down, I saw like really good plow and have thought about going there, but I've always been a little too scared. So that's exactly what these gentlemen did. The third friend stayed on the Groom ski slope path and safely made his way to the valley station. It's like, excuse me. And so I had no clue what the Western Austrian Alps even looked like or where they were really. I just knew they were close to Austria. And so right here to the right is a picture, and you can see Italy, the boot shape, and just north of Italy is that mountain range in what's known as the Western Austrian Alps. So this is a picture actually taken from the case report, and what I wanted to show you all here is this is the gondola, and the gentleman supposedly made their way towards this side of the mountain, and then instead of going straight down towards the left of my screen, they ended up going down towards the bottom of my screen. So the third friend who stuck to the Groom ski slope made it down and noticed that neither of his friends came back. He reported that, and then later it was ascertained that those two snowboarders had actually been buried by a deep powder snow through a spontaneous slab avalanche, which is the most common cause or most common avalanche. And so here I just have the definition of a persistent slab avalanche. It's pretty basic, but and this happens especially on like warmer days where you have like a middle upper snowpacks on this like softer layer, and the bonds between those two layers, like due to many different reasons, but in this case primarily from like UV rays, they just broke apart and then fell. And these can persist for like days, weeks, to even months, these deep persistent slab avalanches. So I have a few just examples of what they look like from afar. Right on the left side, you see that the slab avalanche was triggered remotely, and you have all the skiers to the right there who are safe. But it's interesting to see just like the differences in terrain there. And then on the right, just another example where you see here it's like pretty packed snow, and then you can kind of tell there's these ridges where you get that slab coming off. And that, like previous presenter was saying, like that snow is coming down very fast. You will not be able to outrun that snow. This last picture I have on the left, I thought it was pretty cool. This is just another persistent slab. And this mountaineer guy, he smacked it a few times and was able to actually aggravate it, and it fell off to the right of our screen. On the right side, you'll just see all different types of avalanches, and the persistent slab right here is the most common cause. And that like etched out line that you see there, I think is what they're trying to show is the bonds between the top and the bottom layer. So this happens very often, apparently, and this is just an article I found February 6, 2023, where avalanche killed 11 people in Switzerland, Austria, and Italy. So those Austrian Alps are incredibly dangerous. They look absolutely beautiful. I've never been there, but I can imagine that like hundreds of avalanches happen there per year. So this is from our case study, and the picture on the left, I had zoomed in just this area. So now this is the zoomed out version of this picture, where you can see the middle station gondola. They came down this way and decided to pursue this route in between the trees, and they believe that the avulsion from the avalanche that ended up burying them started in the top right of this picture here. And so here we have an indication of the location of the victims, and then on my right side is just a different view further down the actual mountain, seeing like where they started, where the rescuers started, and where they had to like work their way up to eventually get to the location of the victims. One thing I wanted to point out here is that there's like a rock around here somewhere that created a air pocket for the gentleman that survived. And I'll go into that a little bit later, but I thought I would just make note of it here while we have this picture up. So the search and rescue team was immediately called right after that third gentleman, reported it. And during the night, 80 centimeters of snow fell, the visibility was low, and an avalanche warning of 4 out of 5 was still in effect. And I should have mentioned that the gentleman who actually went out there, they knew that the avalanche warning was at a 4 out of 5 because it was at a 4 out of 5 that entire day. So it wasn't just at night when they were searching for them as well. So by 11 p.m. they concluded the search and rescue because conditions were just too dangerous. So friend number one, the following day around 10 a.m. They found the 2 missing snowboarders, and the first one was friend number one. Unfortunately, he was pronounced dead after extrication, likely secondary to asphyxiation, occurring 15 to 30 minutes after burial per postmortem examination. And this is common, right? This is the most common cause of death following an avalanche, is the asphyxiation. So the way that they describe it, I think, is that he actually had like ice in his mouth, and maybe I just sort of pictured that. But I found that to be pretty remarkable. So for our patient, the following day around 10 a.m., the Avalanche dogs, they found our gentleman, and he had been buried for 20 hours at a depth of 2.3 meters below the surface. And he was found in a lateral position with his legs bent. His ski goggles, which were apparently a little bit larger for him, slipped over his mouth and nose, forming a small air pocket. And then they noticed that there was an air connection that was between like a large air pocket and a nearby, or created by this like nearby rock. So here, and we've seen this actually in the previous presentations, but here's a graphic showing just how detrimental and precipitous your mortality is by time. So your survival probability continues to drop quite rapidly once you get past that like 20-minute, 40-minute mark. So we're talking about somebody who was there for 20 hours. Pretty remarkable. So at extrication, this is our patient. His extratympanic temperature was 22.5, and just baseline hypothermia is anything below 35 degrees C. The patient was responsive, but moved restlessly and uncoordinatedly. And surprisingly, there were no like sensory or motor deficits, because if we were run into a patient who was just experienced an avalanche and there's no like obvious signs of trauma, if they did have some sensory or motor deficits, then you'd be thinking, like a C-spine injury or some sort of like spinal compression, which may warrant like a different approach in getting them out. The patient was warmed using chemical heat packs on the trunk and firmly placed into a rescue bag before getting evacuated to a tertiary care center. This is something I added here, and we mentioned a little bit in the guidelines talk that we use core body temperature as our gold standard to assess like hyperthermia, but in the field where you might not have the proper equipment, you use the revised Swiss system, and that's just taking their symptoms and sort of estimating their core body temperature. Here is an on-site medical management 2021 protocol that I grabbed from the European Council guidelines. I just added them in here to show you like a workflow, and we have other guidelines. We have just tonight seen a few different types of guidelines, but I'll move on from that. Y'all can help me get that. But yeah, so I have this here, and then we went over a few other ones, but what I wanted to just do is like bring it down to like the basics, the very basics, and that's A, B, C, D, E. Right? You check their airway. Like, is there something like completely like visibly blocking their airway, and are you able to remove it in order to resuscitate them? Are they breathing at all? And do you need to start like chest compressions if you don't feel a pulse or anything, right? And like, are they disabled, right? Do they have C-spine injury or any form of spinal injury that you need to like stabilize them before moving them anywhere else? And what are the exposures? Are the people who are rescuing this patient, are they safe? You know, once you remove them from the snow, previously they were in this like warm pocket under tons of snow, but the second you like expose them to the air, you need to think about how their body temperature might react to even like colder and colder environments. That could actually even exacerbate the hypothermia that you're already fighting against. So I just wanted to put this in here because don't forget about your ABCs when seeing a patient that's in like a critical situation. And you all went into more detail about this protocol. I just thought I'd add it in here. So back to the case. So vitals on hospital presentation, which is about 1 hour after extrication, was temperature of 24.1 degrees C for the urinary catheter. His systolic blood pressure was between 80 to 95 millimeters of mercury. So that's pretty low, significantly low. The EKG showed sinus bradycardia at a BPM, or like beats per minute, of 35, which is pretty common in hypothermia. But they also showed Osborne/J waves, a right bundle branch block, and multiple broad complex extrasystoles. And they didn't offer the EKGs, but I just thought I'd add this here to remind everyone what J waves or Osborne waves kind of look like. So following the R wave here, you come down and you get this little like bump up that comes in this area. I don't know if anyone else is like more eloquent in describing, you know, EKGs. By all means, take the lead here. But I thought I would add these just to see like morphologically what do they look like, and they can get a lot worse the more severe the hypothermia is. I actually saw this in a patient. I was in Alaska and they had drowned for a long period of time. They're severely hypothermic. We got to witness those. It's another example of like an Osborne wave, just a little different morphology. So the ABG on hospital presentation looked like this. The patient was on room air. Their PO2 was 146, their PCO2 was 56, and the pH was 7.22. So I thought I'd ask the crowd real quick, you know, take a second, think to yourself, well, what do y'all think this acid-base disturbance is?
Do we have a student who could work us through? Or a resident?
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, I think, you know, we can all tell that this is some form of acidemia. I mean, a pH of 7.22 is well below the normal. So this is some acidemia. And then their PO2 is 146, which is well above the normal. And then their PCO2 is 56. This is some sort of like respiratory acidosis that they're having, whether it's from like hypoventilation or some other like etiologies. I mean, when you think about it, they've been under snow for 20 hours, right? Their whole body is probably experiencing some like metabolic and respiratory acidosis. On physical exam, both legs showed non-refreezing cold injuries, edema of the soles, toes, and mild cyanosis. So what was done? When the patient was admitted to the ICU, they put an A line in the right radial artery and central venous line in the right jugular. They measured central venous pressure of 16, which is actually a little elevated. And it wasn't clear from the study whether that was checked before or after fluid resuscitation. So I thought I'd just like make that point. The patient was given 9 liters of crystalloid over 18 hours due to concerns for exsicosis, or just dehydration. And rewarming was done via continuous hemodialysis with a rewarming speed of 1 degree C per hour. And then within 4 hours, the core body temperature raised to 29.8, from 29.8 to, no, excuse me, from 24.1 to 29.8, which is still showing hypothermia, right? We said below 35 is anyway hypothermic. So those tactics were not working for this gentleman in particular. Hemodialysis stopped and the patient rewarmed spontaneously back to normal eventually. So day 1 in the ICU, the patient's pulmonary function was actually deteriorating, and a follow-up ABG was done, where it showed a PaO2 of 61 millimeters of mercury and PCO2 of 23. So when you think about that, from like the other ABG that we had, that PCO2 is like much, much lower, or even like half as low as when he first presented. So if I were to like picture this patient with that ABG, they're probably severely hyperventilating and just like blowing off tons and tons of CO2. And so the next step that they took was using a CPAP machine with high flow oxygen. And the reasons they did so was because when they grabbed an X-ray, and this is not the X-ray from the actual case. I just took this and I typed in pulmonary edema, and shows the bilateral interstitial infiltrates. And the description that the radiologist had given to our patient is incipient infiltrates in the left middle lobe, suggestive of pulmonary infection and bilateral interstitial pulmonary edema. And a follow-up CT was done and showed bilateral overhydration and confluent alveolar infiltrates, probably hypothermia with capillary leak and extravasation in combination with lung contusion. So the fluids are stopped, and pretty much the patient spontaneously diuresed, which happens all the time, even in non-avalanche situations. So in day 2, something else that was kind of interesting is that the patient became febrile to 39 degrees C, which was treated pharmacologically and physical cooling, and then kind of went away on its own. There wasn't really much mentioned about this, but I found this pretty cool, and it's actually used in like post cardiac arrest treatment. And then there had been described a few cases where following that hypothermic treatment, there would be some patients who have this like rebound fever. And from what I know, or what I understand, or what I've read, is that the etiology of that is like still unknown. But I found that to be pretty cool. It's interesting. And it went away on its own though. So from my understanding, it's not much to be too concerned about. So on day 4 in the ICU, the patient had recovered virtually completely. The onboard neurologist said he's got full cerebral recovery, might have some subtle polyneuropathy, paresthesias in his legs, but they weren't really concerned about his non-refreezing cold injuries. They didn't think there was any necrosis or reason to like amputate any of his extremities. So the patient was DC'd at that point from the ICU on day 4. Some things I want to just point out here is that the authors do recognize that there are current guidelines in place, and that's some things that they did in this study, which had taken place in 2000. They may have not done 100% correctly or to standards that we have nowadays. So one of which is that if you have a patient who's got a core temperature below 30 or they're systolic, blood pressure is below 90 millimeters of mercury, or if they have any sort of arrhythmia or cardiac instability, you want to like immediately and directly send them to a center where they can do ECLS or extracorporeal life support. Because if all else fails in rewarming them, that's like your gold standard. Although it's like super invasive, it's the most effective way of doing so, from what I understand. Another thing that the I pretty much just said the exact same thing. It's just said a little bit differently, but they do recognize that is different. Those guidelines are different from the early 2000s. Something I noticed like on my own, and I'm a 4th year medical student, haven't gone through my residency training, but something I noticed that was like kind of odd is that when they were placing their A-line, they went for his radial instead of cannulating the femoral first. And when I look back at the guidelines, right, the guidelines suggest femoral from the beginning, because you don't want to exacerbate anything like with the heart, or like cause any arrhythmias, or send this guy into cardiac arrest. So they do suggest that you insert central venous catheters in the femoral as well as arterial lines. So just discussing this case, and y'all have seen this graphic actually a little bit prior, but this one combines 2 studies and shows like Canada, Austria, Switzerland. I was showing you previously a graphic with just Austria and Switzerland, but now here's Canada added here, and And the authors really wanted to make the point that burial time was exceptionally long in this case. Like only 2 people have ever really survived like beyond this point. There was one person who survived 43 hours and 45 minutes. It's like an Italian lady in 1972, and there's another survived 25 hours and 30 minutes in Canada. It's a 59-year-old male. So these are exceptional cases because, right, like if you look at the x-axis here on this chart, this graphic here, these are minutes, not hours. So it's pretty remarkable that these people have survived, and that's why this case report was so fascinating. But after like doing a quick little, I just Googled, and apparently there's another gentleman here. Mountaineer survives being buried for 20 hours after an avalanche. So I guess this is happening all over the world. I wonder if that's even the same place too. This Italian gentleman is somewhere in the Alps up there. This is borrowed, but just kind of goes over the algorithm again. And so when thinking about this case, and obviously I'd like to open it up for discussion, but some things that can help mitigate like morbidity and help improve mortality are the degree of the head and chest burial, the duration that we just talked about, the depth of the burial, the patency of the airway, the presence and volume of an air pocket, the snow density, the traumatic injuries that were inflicted on the patient. Some others like that I wanted to mention is like, are they hypothermic also, and did they experience any cardiac arrhythmias that had gone unseen while they were covered with that snow, which could have easily caused or could have been the main cause of death. But like we had previously mentioned, that like 75% of the cases it's due to asphyxiation. So here I have like the median burial survival depth, which is 70 centimeters compared to those who actually died, which is 100 centimeters. Not that big of a difference. Our patient was buried at 230 centimeters. So what could have potentially helped him survive? I just wanted to ask this question to the general group here, because I can think of a few things that are pretty unique about this person. So first one I could think of is that this patient's goggles were quite large and covered both his mouth and nose. So when we're saying like 75% of all deaths caused by avalanche or secondary asphyxiation, this may have very well been like a huge reason why he survived, is that goggle just slowly came over his nose and mouth and didn't give any access to snow to cause obstruction. Then I was kind of also curious, like, was it his positioning? Our patient was lying sideways, wasn't upright, and it wasn't like facing down. They were lying on their side, and only 15% of victims that were found that survived were lying on their side. So I was kind of curious if maybe that could have been one of the reasons their body didn't necessarily have to work as hard to perfuse all of their like extremities. And air pockets definitely matter. So the rate of survival with and without an air pocket at less than 180 minutes, again, minutes, was pretty significant. So you see here that the duration of burial is greater than 15. There's an air pocket. You're, at a 67% chance of surviving, according to this study. So I thought that was pretty significant. And we do know that in this case study, our patient was near like a large rock formation that was creating an air pocket for him. So something that I wanted to discuss was the fact that, let's see if I went into it a little bit. The fact that our patient, developed this spontaneous pulmonary edema. And so what I didn't know is that you can have pulmonary edema caused just from the avalanche covering up your body. So you get this thing called like negative pressure pulmonary edema, where you're trying to like inhale against an obstruction, and you create this negative pressure within your intrathoracic cavity, and then you get like tons and tons of preload coming to you, and you get extravasation. And so like your hydrostatic pressure increases, and then you get extravasation of that fluid into your lungs. Another mechanism could be hypoxia, just from left ventricular heart failure or pulmonary arterial hypertension. And third could be like capillary leak or extravasation, secondary trauma, or like prolonged hypothermia and inflammation. So provided proper medical support, avalanche burial-related pulmonary edema, which is incredibly rare according to the study, resolves within 24 hours with CPAP and negative fluid balance. So this was the case with our patient, and is definitely possible for the etiology of this pulmonary edema. But I was kind of curious, you know, and this is the reason why I asked my question earlier, like, is there a protocol for fluid resuscitation in patients who might be severely dehydrated but are like also hypothermic? Some things like definitely to consider is the use of normal saline over lactated ringer, because patients who are hypothermic, they're not able to effectively metabolize lactate because they're in a state of like metabolic acidosis as well. Their body just does not have enough oxygen to do oxidative phosphorylation or respiratory oxidation. So definitely can, you know, use normal saline. Recommendations are to warm it up to 38 to 42 degrees C, or about like body temperature, before you introduce it. And then from my understanding, you know, I use the 4-2-1 rule when I'm thinking about maintenance fluids or bolus fluids. And I just put in my own like 160 pounds, my 160 pound weight into MedCalc, and I got 113 mils per hour for maintenance, 169 mils per hour at a 1.5 dose. And then I got 1455 milliliters as a bolus. So for them to introduce 9 liters, you know, over 18 hours, was interesting to see, and I'm curious if that may have also been the cause of his pulmonary edema. I guess the actual timeline from when it occurred was not clear to me. So if anyone has any commentary on that, I'd appreciate that. But in conclusion, the authors pretty much said, you know, patients can live a very long time. People can live very, very long time, and especially if there's like an air pocket involved, or if you have a regular ski mask that goes over your mouth and you prevent some form of asphyxiation, or if you just cover your nose up and your mouth up like we discussed earlier, patients can live, and you can survive without significant neurological like damage because you're pretty much you know, being preserved under a massive sheet of ice. So your metabolic demand is going to be substantially lower than, let's say, on like a hot sunny day. So that was my understanding of their conclusions. Like, don't give up. Still send out the search party, even if you're over, you know, 20 hours of searching. Some considerations I wanted to add to this study is checking electrolyte status. They were not able to get that for this patient, although they did say that he was like his base access was like negative. I'm assuming that they got his electrolytes, but they didn't tell us like what lactate levels were. But you may not see any like EKG changes, even if you have a hyperkalemia due to like a severe acidotic state. So you can't always rely on your EKG to give you those answers. And then J waves, or those Osborne waves that I was talking all about earlier, they could be associated with subarachnoid hemorrhages, ACS, or like normal variants. Some people just have them, so it doesn't necessarily mean a patient's hypothermic. So context matters. And then, like I mentioned before, ECMO, cardiopulmonary bypass are the most invasive but effective ways to rewarm an unstable patient. Thought I'd mention, you know, quick point of care glucose assessment, I think would be also like pretty necessary. And then, you know, this is where I want to open up for discussion, right? Like, assess fluid status carefully and fluid replete based on clinical judgment. You know, these are things that I look at when I'm on wards, but in this setting, it seems to be pretty tricky. And I'm not sure, because if you volume overload, you can definitely send somebody in like ARDS and they could quickly decompensate and die. So I'm happy to see that this patient survived and everything went totally normal, but kind of curious. This is just a fluid resuscitation protocol. How you assess fluid status, like sensitivity, specificity for each form of assessing fluid status. But I think these are all outside the scope of the discussion. So I thought I'd, I'm done with the presentation. I thought I'd just like ask the group, what else could have potentially helped this gentleman survive? Because it's a pretty miraculous case.
I think it was an interesting example of the just total duration. He's lucky he had that air pocket, because I'm also curious at how much of that he was actually aware. Like, at what point did he sort of just become, lethargic and obtunded? Oh, hi, bud. So there was another case, I think it's somewhere in the article list for Avalanche from a couple years ago, is there was a skier who was very lightly clothed. I think it was like light pants and like a base layer and nothing else. He got completely buried to somewhere around 2 meters. They got him out after 2 hours, which again shows essentially a prolonged burial. He stood up and then immediately collapsed, despite them telling, "Hey, don't stand up. You were just buried." Like, it's, you don't want your hypothermic patients moving, especially not standing up. And he immediately collapsed and went into cardiac arrest, and they couldn't get him back. So the hypothermia does occasionally play a role, but only if these patients have these wonderful large air pockets. So Michael, I had a question. So let's say you get the notification that there's been an avalanche burial and the patient's been buried already for a prolonged amount of time. Does that change like your team's response? Like, do you still get out the same exact number of responders, or you're like, well, you know what, let's see what we can do?
That's a good question. I think
I don't know what Michael you were talking about.
Let's say B. who's been boots on the ground.
I'm like, thank you for trusting me to answer this question. I mean, I could, think of something.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So let's talk about what a response actually looks like. And I don't know how it is in every other place in the world. I know how it is in my neck of the woods. So let's say that you're lucky enough that you have an avalanche that happens where you have cell phone service, right? Which it's hit or miss. But let's say that happens. You call up on your cell phone and it pings to the nearest tower, and the dispatch center can triangulate kind of where you are, and you can tell them, hey, I'm in this area. So the dispatch center will say, okay, this is a search and rescue response. This isn't, because really there's two responses that happen 99% of the time, right? There's police or fire, and they're trying to decide, is this a police response or a fire response, right? Because fire and EMS are the same here in Utah. And so from there, it's a search and rescue response. So it goes to the county sheriff's office, because that's who runs the search and rescue here in Utah. It goes to the county that you're in. And then whoever is on the phone for them will say, oh, okay, so we have this search and rescue response. The search and rescue response in general is volunteer. So, it's here in the Valley, we want to have, like, say, a person for a medical within the first 5 minutes, right? So by the time you get a call to the time the medical gets there, 5 to 7 minutes, maybe a little quicker on a fire, or a little slower on a fire response, thinking that people have to get their gear on. But in a search and rescue, it's all bets are off. You have to call people in. The watch commander or the sheriff's deputy, whoever gets the call from the search and rescue, they might at that point call us as a resource, but we're a resource, right, for the search and rescue, for the incident command. We don't take command, and we are very careful bringing our helicopter into avalanche terrain because it's like a $9 million helicopter. We don't want it to be buried in an avalanche, right? So we are also very careful in that we are not on the helicopter first responders in the traditional sense that we're going to be in there unburying people. We're there for medical response only, if that makes sense. So, our thing is that now this does happen where we get on scene first, and we'll go to the patient and kind of figure out what needs to happen. But in the Wasatch, generally what happens is the search and rescue gets called out. Wasatch Backcountry Rescue, which is a team that has a couple avalanche dogs and that consists of professional ski patrollers from around like Solitude, Alta, Snowbird, and the surrounding canyons. They all have ski patrollers that are part of this rescue system that then they could say, okay, we're going to come, we're going to respond. He wants to say, hey, we're going to respond. And so our helicopter might go to say Snowbird, say that's the closest ski resort, Snowbird, and we'll pick up their guys. So maybe we'll drop the nurse off, we'll drop all of our equipment off, we'll pick up a couple ski patrollers, we'll drop them into the area, and then they're gonna help do the rescue. So as you can tell, this probably takes a ton of time, right? Like if we're there within an hour or so, that's a good time, I would imagine, right? Like considering all the search and rescue people and everything that has to happen. Now, if you're out in the middle of nowhere in the boondocks, there are cases. We have a team in an area that's like a super close helicopter that's into this mountain range that's really far from any search and rescue. So there are opportunities for us to be there first before any search and rescue people, but we're pretty risk averse as far as our team on the ground. We're not trained avalanche professionals, right? We're not trained rescuers. We carry beacons, but that's for ourselves in case we get buried, not for rescue purposes. But if, let's say, the best case scenario, we get the patient, they think that they're, we unbury them, we'll go in and we'll check our cardiac monitor just like we would anybody else, and then figure out from there. So I don't think that the response is going to be any different than anything else based off of the initial assessment we might receive from the patient and the search and rescue. Most likely we give it the best chance, like any other search and rescue response, right? Like that's the big thing in mountain rescue, that have a good response, and we're going to expect everybody to be alive. But the facts are the facts, and most people at that point probably aren't. Now, as I said, nobody's ever died from hypothermia in the state of Utah. On the last big avalanche, as I said, the one mentioned, it was, if anybody's really interested, it's called the Wilson Glade Avalanche. You can look it up on the Utah Avalanche Center's website. They have a very extensive coverage of it and like a really good report on it. But Lifelight and AirMed, we were in charge of bringing rescuers in, and then we were bringing alive victims out. But as far as people, we weren't a part of any sort of rescue, and I wasn't a member of that. And I don't think that we hoisted. Lifelight also has a hoist program. We're the only civilian hoist program. Every other hoist program is Park Service or Sheriff's Office. But I don't recall if we had anybody that we hoisted out, because I think there was a good landing zone and people could just hop on. So I don't know. I knowing what I know, expecting search and rescue to save an avalanche victim here in the United States is unrealistic at best. It really is up to who's ever there, unfortunately. Hey, buddy. Sorry, my babysitter left.
that segues into why it's so important for like every member of your group you're with, and to always travel with at least one or two other people. More people in the group, more people to act as your rescuers if you get buried. So you want everybody to have a beacon, everybody have a shovel, everybody have a probe in your group, because it's a bystander that's going to save the person who's buried.
And these are skills that are they go away after time, right? So if you think about it, MDs, right, or anybody else, intubations, if you do a lot of them, like the skill is there, right? And so like in my service, they require us to do 4. They require us to go to the OR, get a minimum of 4 every quarter. Usually we get a lot more than that because it's such an important skill, but it's easily lost. And you think about even like doing a cricothyrotomy, right? Like who's ever done one of those? It's like such a low common, not a very common occurrence. But when you need to know how to do it, you need to know how to do it. The same with an avalanche rescue, right? You don't every day go out and do an avalanche rescue, but at minimum at the beginning of the season, and maybe once or twice throughout, you should be out there burying beacons and just sort of getting that muscle memory going. So when it's the real deal, you don't have to worry about like, what button do I have to press? Where's my probe? Where's my shovel? If you just practice that, it goes a long way. Minutes do matter.
All right. Well, thanks to everybody who has presented. Hearing at the end here, anybody have questions before we end? We've reached about 2 hours, and I think we're all tired and have kids of various ages who need to probably go to bed soon. Mine's already in bed. We just woke up though.
Boy, those were phenomenal presentations. Thank you, Michael and Sarah, for your time and putting those together. All the insights.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. Next month, we have base station medicine as our topic. We have 2 ACPs and a doc who have all worked as medical providers in Antarctica who's going to be joining. And anybody who's an ACP, they're going to talk about all the cool stuff they can do as well. Small clinics like Alaska, small islands in Hawaii, and all over the place. So I'll see you all next month. Thanks for joining.